One thing that's often overlooked in education is the importance of experiences. Experiences are this ability for us to take what we've learned and create something memorable based off of it. Often, unfortunately, our students are very much impacted by lack of experiences. If you look at experiences and the roles they play in constructing knowledge, and that being a resource that often is not given to our students based off of socioeconomic factors that impact then retention of content, especially over the summer or different periods of time, we realize more and more that experiences are important. Now, when you look at learning something, right? In order to learn something, you have done what? You remember it. How do we formulate memories, and how do we teach to make sure that that happens? So majority of us remember going to school, hopefully, right? And you probably learned a lot about English, math. You probably remember a decent amount of math, science. That you've covered this content, you must to a degree remember it because you still can read and write and you can still do basic math probably, right? But for the most part, how it's taught, scaffolded and constructed and ongoing and very similar and predictable, and a lot of times absent to any context of why are we doing this and why am I learning it. Chances are a good majority of stuff you don't remember, and the things that you do are because you covered it so much that it becomes this autopilot kind of a thing of now you can just read because you know that you were in school and you learned how to read and you just can do that, opposed to actually knowing specific things that you covered in those classes over a period of time, right? And this is common. I'm not going against the power of scaffolding or repetition. They both have a place, but for a majority of students, especially students impacted by trauma, especially students that live under socioeconomic disadvantages, if you don't bring relevancy or an experience to ignite that initial, why do I have to learn this, then it really doesn't matter how much you cover something and how many times it's scaffolded, right? If it's irrelevant from day one, it's going to continue to be irrelevant no matter how much you try to push it, right? When our students are underperforming, what do? More English, more math, and then we realize why has attendance gone down? Why has behavioral issues gone up, et cetera, and so forth. We get all these unaware things that we didn't expect then impacting the students, and then we realize that our efforts are worse than what it would have been if we would have just left it the way it is. That's problematic. And this is the example that I give because we usually go to if the student isn't learning it, then maybe they don't care about their future, right? That's something that we jump to. I remember having that conversation with fellow faculty when I used to teach on Standing Rock, and them talking to me about how so-and-so and so-and-so, a couple students at the school, didn't care about their future because they weren't doing the work. And then 4 or 5 months later, those same exact students during No DAPL literally ran across the United States of America because they had a message that they wanted to give to the president, right? Just because a student isn't doing what you want them to do doesn't mean that they don't care. It might mean that what you're doing is irrelevant because you haven't made any connection or experience to make it worth learning. And if you're a student that has been impacted by trauma or living under severe poverty, you have limited resources, mental energy, etc., based off of that reality of having to live within that space where you can't allocate all this additional energy to something that is beyond surviving, right? And we never really realize that in terms of our students' realities and our teaching and whether or not we're building any connections. So if they're not doing what we're doing, often we assess why, and typically it's inaccurate, right? And I think that's a primary example of how inaccurate a lot of times it really is when we're not realizing the reality of our students. Now, regardless of how intelligent a person is, if that bridge hasn't been made, typically, especially if you are intelligent, you disengage, right? And you allocate what limited energy cognitively you have on things that are truly important for things that you want to accomplish. So I give this analogy all the time as a professor now, 15 years, that at the institution I used to work at, we had about an hour of AFLAC presentation of insurance, right? So I have about 15 hours of AFLAC. I should have a course in AFLAC by now, but still to this day, I can't tell you a damn thing about AFLAC. Now, why is that? Is it because I have a learning exceptionality and I have to be assessed to see whether or not I need an IEP for accommodations and modifications to instruction given to me? Is it because I'm not as smart as the other professors? And, unfortunately, this is what we jump to as a teacher when our students aren't learning what we're trying to teach them, opposed to whether or not there's cultural discontinuity of what we're doing or our delivery, or that we haven't made anything worthwhile for the students to learn it, right? It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. If it's irrelevant, chances are we disengage, especially if you're intelligent, because you have limited resources and you want to make sure that they're allocated to the most important things. That's very common with cognitive development and understanding how the brain works, right? So with lacking connection and creating an experience that impacts our students' engagement of what they learn more so than how smart we think that they are. And that's usually what we jump to, and it's unfortunate, opposed to taking ownership of our instruction and how we teach. Now, chances are when you're in education, getting your degree, or you study in education, cognitive development, teaching and learning, you learn about all these different theorists and how the brain works and all this other stuff. And then when we look at practice and application into the classroom, chances are we don't give any credit to the importance of an experience and how experiences are lasting memories. And in order to learn anything, you have to retain it for an extended period of time. So how do we construct learning around that? Now, chances are when we teach mental, right? Iconography, factual-based information, regurgitation, memorization, blah, 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 right? But if that's absence of the senses, right, or value that we have in regards to the content and constructing the learning that's being received to us, then it becomes more and more less irrelevant. And that's important today when we all have phones and our students have phones, and even if we create laws to take them away, if you have the world at your fingertips, this old model of time and speed, and we're all going at the same exact time and we're all learning the same exact thing, and it doesn't matter if we connect values, experiences, senses in regards to learning that content information, you have to learn it because there's going to be a test on it. That no longer flies. If we want something to actually be memorable, we need to build those connections. And once those connections have been made, then we scaffold, then we have the repetition, and then we see fully our efforts in doing so really compounding and it being worth all that work. But if we haven't made that connection first, it doesn't matter how many times you present it, how important you say it is, if you haven't told them why, right? And I go to this example of place-based knowledge. Now, this is something that I learned from an elder who was talking about learning the month of February, Chana Popawi, which is the month of the popping trees in Lakota, right? Her grandfather brought her and her siblings, the grandkiddos, down to the river where they're from on Cheyenne River to hear the popping sounds of the trees. He didn't tell them what they were going to learn. He didn't tell them that they had to get the same exact thing out of what was being taught. He simply set the stage for the learning to take place, and afterwards did a reflection with his grandkiddos. What did you notice? What did you hear? What did you see? Engaging all those senses. And the kids reflected on what they heard, what they saw, and he said, that's how we get the name for this month, right? He didn't tell her what that month was. He taught her how to experience what that month is. And through that experience, when I was in class with her, when she was teaching Lakota language, when it came close to that month and when she noticed her environment changing, that strengthened her understanding of her language, Lakota, and also that experience because it was tied to senses and something that she'll remember forever, right? Chances are if we don't do that connection, we won't retain it. Now let's look at that in terms of how to artificially create it in our education spaces to build that knowledge. And this is another example of my daughter when she was in the Lakota language nest on Standing Rock. Every single day they would sit on the carpet and they would sing Lakota songs, right? And then when we went back to the cities and we went camping with my mom and my mom's family, my family, right? And my mom wanted to hear all these beautiful songs that Micah now knows in Lakota. She couldn't remember any of them because there was absence of her environment in which she learned it. There's no cues in her environment that she could draw from, right? So then eventually she walked back to where our camper was, where the carpet was, sat down, and instantly replicating how she would have been within the nest, all those songs came back and she started singing it and she could remember it, right? So like once we see things like that as a parent, as an educator, it's beautiful, and it reminds us the importance of relation to learning in space and the senses in retention of information. Unfortunately, majority of our students are lacking those experiences. You know, like if all we were given was a shoebox to live in, we would understand that shoebox very well. But if we had a broader understanding of the world around us, then we're really capitalizing on our synapses, strengthening those pathways. We're really able to like the plasticity of our brain, right? And it being malleable and not concrete. And of course, when you're younger, that's going to be more transparent, where it can do and we can learn faster and greater things and stuff, blah, 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 blah. We've all heard that, you know, but it doesn't mean that we can't keep learning. And with those experiences, we really maximize our true cognitive capabilities, but without them, they truly impact our students' learning. So if we recap, place-based knowledge is important. Learning through the senses brings us to a truth of the information that we're learning. Like absence of context and the senses a lot of times bring us to false truths, things that we think that are true that aren't. And we're seeing that more and more with the fragmentation of news and the absence of those things in the content that we consume now through social media, opposed to making those connections and a broader, deeper understanding of what is being covered. And that's important. So if we're going to design a classroom around that, connecting the senses, creating experiences, and connecting value to content and also novelty will create an opportunity for our students to, in the future, when they're 30, in their mid-30s like me, they'll remember that and they'll light them up in excitement because they actually remember something that was covered in class, opposed to remembering the things. And you probably know this too, as an adult, like, hey, you remember when so-and-so did this? You know, it typically isn't a standard. Like, hey, you remember we addressed that standard? No, it's usually like the thing that we're not supposed to remember because it probably included all the things that I'm talking to you about now. Now, creating content that reflects that will create those great moments in what we're covering and what we're learning in our classrooms. So if you like this, continue watching for future videos where we're finally unpacking just different approaches of teaching and learning from my perspectives of the experiences that I've learned on Standing Rock Reservation and working with elders who have taught me so much that have made me, I think, a much better teacher than I would have gotten through the content that was covered in college when I was becoming a teacher. So stay tuned for more.